A 40-foot wave of molasses raced through Boston faster than a sprinting horse. It wasn't liquid. It was thick as concrete, shimmering like molten glass. At 12:40 p.m. on a January afternoon, the steel tank towering over the north end exploded. What burst out wasn't a spill. It was a scalding brown wall strong enough to tear steel girders like ribbon. A patrolman on duty vanished beneath the wave. A freight car was lifted off the rails and thrown aside. And then came the most intimate horror of all, a child's hand breaking the surface, fingers still moving, grasping at air that wasn't there. When the wave settled, 21 were dead, more than 100 injured, and the street looked like it had been paved in brown glass. But the strangest part is what came after. How did a tank everyone knew was failing kill 21 people when every warning was ignored? More than a century later, on the hottest summer afternoons, locals swear the north end still smells like warm sugar, where the wave once killed. The tank didn't fail out of nowhere. People heard it coming. Every afternoon, workers reported the same unnerving sound. Deep groans rolling across the waterfront. Steel complaining under a weight it was never designed to hold. Kids playing stickball said the tank sometimes popped, sharp enough to bounce between brick walls. Managers waved it off as settling sounds. The visual signs were harder to deny. Thick molasses seeped from the seams, sliding down the sides in slow, glistening ribbons. The company's fix wasn't reinforcement, it was camouflage. They painted it brown so the leaks would blend in. Locals still collected drips in jars and joked that this was the sweetest street in Boston. The people standing closest sensed the danger most clearly. A night watchman refused to lean against the structure, saying the steel felt too soft for something that size. He wasn't wrong. The tank had never been properly engineered. Its thin steel plates and undersized rivets were already straining. But the real danger wasn't visible. It was physics. The tank was nearly 50 feet tall, and the taller a column of liquid, the more crushing the pressure at its base. Hydrostatic force that grows with every foot of height. Filled with dense, heavy molasses, the bottom rivets were holding back pressure comparable to a concrete skyscraper pushing outward. Fermentation pushed it further. Warm molasses produced carbon dioxide gas, adding internal pressure and turning the tank into a sealed pressure cooker. Executives ignored every warning. They were racing to store as much molasses as possible before Prohibition cut off their biggest profits. So here's the question. If you heard that tank groaning outside your window every day in 1919, would you move your family or trust the authorities to act first? Nothing hinted the tank beside them was seconds from explosive failure. First came the metallic cracks, sharp, unnatural. Rivets shot free like bullets. Then the steel plate tore loose, and the entire tank convulsed. A rolling boom followed, so powerful people miles away mistook it for an anarchist bomb. Mail bomb scares were still fresh. Then the true horror hit. Hot molasses, 2.3 million gallons, erupting outward in a 40-foot wave. Iron buckled, rails twisted upward like pulled ribbon. A delivery cart vanished instantly, swallowed whole. Horses were swept sideways, hooves drumming against debris. Men lay trapped under shattered planks as the street turned black and fast. For a heartbeat, everything went silent. Then came the long, low hiss, the wave losing its first burst of force. Screams followed an instant later, sharp and scattered. A delivery truck spun as it was lifted, then crashed back down, half submerged, its wheels still spinning uselessly above the surface. And for those caught in the wave, survival was a nightmare just beginning. Molasses doesn't just drown you. It traps you. It's a sheer thickening fluid. Under slow movement, it behaves like syrup, but under sudden force, like panic thrashing, it hardens instantly. Every desperate kick made it clamp down tighter, quicksand made of syrup, turning struggle into a death sentence. Firefighter George Lay was one of the few who could later describe what it felt like. He had been standing near the Engine 31 firehouse when the wave hit. 40 feet of hot, brown mass slamming him off his feet as if a fist the size of a building had struck him. He didn't tumble or roll. He was folded into it, pressed sideways, the world reduced to heat and pressure in an instant. He said the first thing he realized wasn't pain, it was weight. The molasses felt alive, shoving him flat, squeezing his ribs until each breath came thin and desperate. He found a pocket of air only because a shattered barrel wedge beside him created a small cavity. Everything outside that bubble was muffled to a distant, underwater rumble, with snapping, horses screaming, someone shouting names that vanished into syrup. Instinct told him to fight, but the moment he pushed, the molasses tightened. His arms locked. His boots froze. It was like trying to run inside concrete, that hadn't decided whether it wanted to be liquid or solid. He forced himself still. That was the only way to keep the tiny air pocket from collapsing. Sometimes he could feel objects shift through the dark. Planks, nails, splintered beams drifting slowly past, carried by the heavy current. One struck his shoulder. It didn't bounce. It pressed in and stayed, the molasses gripping it as firmly as it gripped him. Even tiny motions had consequences. A twitch of the knee would thicken the mass around his leg. A gasp would send the syrup squeezing tighter against his chest. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes felt like hours. Later tests confirmed what survivors already knew. The wave wasn't just hot and heavy. Its physics turned the very act of breathing into a negotiation. For George and hundreds like him, survival meant fighting an enemy you couldn't outrun, couldn't push off, couldn't reason with. Only endure. And while isolated survivors wrestled for air in their private pockets of darkness, the city above was facing its own nightmare. When the wave stopped, the disaster didn't. Commercial Street looked peeled open. Buildings were reduced to frames, their facades sheared away. Rail lines curled upward like twisted ribbon. And the horses, 8 from D'Estasio's stables, swept away whole in the first surge, now lay scattered across the street, their bodies baked stiff beneath hardened molasses crusts. Movement was still nearly impossible. Boats didn't glide, they stalled. Firemen stepped off ladders and disappeared to their hips. Ropes sank the moment they touched the surface. Crews wrapped canvas over their faces to breathe through the syrupy air. Pumps jammed instantly, and hose engines overheated within minutes. The only option was brutal, slow labor. Shovels, axes, bare arms pushing through the thickening mess. So the city turned to seawater, because it was the only thing thin enough to cut the molasses. Fire crews pumped salt water from the harbor onto the streets, turning each block into a slow-moving brown river that inched toward the docks. They thought they'd finally cleared Commercial Street by January 17th. Then Antonio DeMambro opened the hatch to his basement. For feet of still warm molasses, 80 degrees even days later, poured out like fresh lava, rolling back into the street. The disaster kept expanding. Boston Harbor turned muddy brown for 6 months. Molasses layers sat on the seafloor like weighted blankets, suffocating marine life. Fish floated up slick with syrup. Lobsters washed ashore miles away, coated in sticky residue. Waterfront timbers absorbed the smell and held it for months. Weeks scraped the streets. Months scrubbed the buildings. Years before the scent finally loosened from brickwork. Children playing in springs still sidestepped brown puddles, whispering they'd pull you under. And for the survivors, the disaster never quite left. Fireman Jerry Shea couldn't stomach pancakes again. The smell hit like a flashback. Dock worker Antonio Pones quit the waterfront entirely. The texture of molasses haunted his skin long after it was gone. But while the city shoveled sludge, another disaster was forming in offices and courtrooms. More than 100 lawsuits would drag on for years. In the courtroom, tension hung thick and slow, molasses heavy, but without chaos. Every person inside knew this was the moment Boston had been waiting for. The company's lawyers rose first, crafting a defense that tried to outrun physics, rust, and reality itself. They blamed anarchists, invoked an act of God, and pointed to freak weather, a shield of excuses stacked deliberately to block responsibility. But the prosecution dismantled that shield piece by piece. Engineers took the stand and demonstrated how pressure multiplies with every added foot of liquid. Weight far beyond what the tank's thin steel could endure. Then they drew the line from cause to effect. That immense pressure pushed against rusted rivets long past their limits. Every patched seam, every weeping joint, was evidence of a disaster waiting to happen. The science wasn't abstract. It was damning. Jurors listened and paled. Some gripped their armrests, as if bracing against an unseen force. And then came a silence, unlike the stunned silence outside on the day of the flood. This one was suffocating, a hush so complete it felt like it pressed down on every chest in the room. Closing arguments landed with the weight of inevitability. The verdict was less a decision than gravity, straightforward, unyielding. The company was found liable. Damages were ordered, sweeping and unprecedented. According to safety officials at the time, the case effectively rewrote industrial law before the ink was dry. Nationwide, steel tanks could no longer be filled on trust alone. Pressure testing, documented inspections, certified materials. These became mandatory, not optional. The legacy of Boston's sticky streets reshaped entire industries. But even as the courtroom emptied and the lawyers gathered their papers, something lingered, an echo of the flood that refused to fade. The disaster still had one more strange, haunting truth to reveal. Molasses soaked soil, brick, and would like perfume into fabric. Heat brings the scent back. When it does, engineers remember ignored pressure gauges. City planners remember cheap construction kills. Boston remembers disasters refuse to fade. They wait for summer. North End locals report the sweet odor on hottest afternoons, decades later. Not imagination. Capillary action pulled molasses molecules deep into porous brickwork and soil. Summer heat volatilizes trapped sugar derivatives. Gas chromatography confirms. 1919-era bricks from the flood zone contain measurable molasses compounds. Cleanup crews smelled it weeks later. Firefighters' boots stuck months after clean. Horses avoided routes for years. Sweetness became a symbol of negligence. Hubris dismissing warnings. Danger disguised as harmless. Every warm gust through the North End asks Boston. Did we learn? Some disasters never fully wash away. The streets still smell sweet. The warning signs never stop screaming. We live surrounded by slow disasters we choose not to see. If we can't escape the past, should we build monuments to it? Or let it fade into the smell of summer? Psyche and Earth.